Hello, everyone. I am your host, Benjamin Chen. Today, we have with us Aurora Akanksha, who is currently a UN official where she takes part in various programs such as the UN Development Program. She also announced her candidacy to challenge the seat of the Secretary General of the UN in February. If elected, she will be the first female Secretary General in the history of the United Nations. Thank you so much, Ms. Akanksha, for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled and delighted to be here.
All right, let's just get into it then. So during previous interviews, you mentioned before, there are two United Nations. The first one takes up 25%, which is the UN that makes decisions. However, there is another whole 75% of the UN that actually implements the decision. Your candidacy is formed in the framework of making that implementation process better. So would you mind elaborating more on that part?
Absolutely. And I think just to make everyone understand the concept of implementation and decision making, think of COVID. We're all going through this crisis. When heads of states passed a decision that we will invest in a vaccine, that's called a decision. Would any of us call that success? No. Even when the vaccine was made, would any of us call that success over COVID? No. We in our own lives judge success of any event based on implementation. So for us, we would all have been successful over COVID. Once we all have the vaccine and it's administered in our arms, we can go back to open society. So for our own lives, judgment criteria is implementation. But when it comes to the UN, a lot of time we're talking about lives of people we cannot see, problems we cannot feel, problems we haven't seen anywhere else. We're just reading text about it. So we just stop the conversation at decision making. Oh, crisis is happening in Syria, crisis is happening in Myanmar. Like decision making, that's it. We stop at the implementation. And my candidacy is all about ensuring that the decisions that are passed by member states are implemented all the way through so we can see benefit in the lives of people. And I'll give you a few examples. Development. In 1980, China's GDP was below all but three African countries. And look where China is today without any UN assistance. And over 40 years, Africa is a continent that has received the most funding. We've passed the most decision resolution. And where is it? That's because we failed in doing a good job in implementation. And that is what my candidacy is about. And implementation can only be done by youth in the most impactful way. So that's something I'd love to talk about more, youth engagement.
All right. So correct me if I'm wrong. Currently, for every dollar in the UN, we see 29 cents going into the actual problem. This has been a long-term and very obvious problem for the UN. So what do you think is the key that is stopping anyone from making any positive changes regarding this in the past 75 years?
I think the problem is that we don't focus enough on it so there's a decision making that the world talks about. Implementation, the only people who know are employees, and employees are not given a chance to express their opinions to the public. Their contracts could get rescinded. Employees are not allowed to share their views with the leadership or member states. So these are the people who know all the data and figures. That's why you haven't heard of it. It's going on for a long time. Why is it going on? It's because the priorities of the organization is more around just saying we're doing good things than actually doing it. How do we fix it is where it's very important. How do we fix it is we bring in technology, we bring in innovation into the delivery mechanism. And I'll give you an example. Today, when we have crises in any foreign country, most of the time their language is not English. We bring in translators from all over the world to help translate. Why don't we have an app that could do translation for us so we can save all the money and it could go towards beneficiary? The other thing is when it comes to humanitarian emergencies, we engage in recruiting international people or even national people. Why can't we just engage local, like people who are in the crisis, refugees? For example, you have refugee camps and we bring in others to help them. We can like employ refugees and make sure that the funding is used towards them rather than going outside of the cause. And that is what my candidacy is about, to bring innovation and technology into the delivery to make sure that we engage with those we're serving and to allow young people to volunteer in these situations where it's safe and get meaningful experience and make sure that the funding again is used for the cause primarily.
Right, innovation and technology. So how would you link youth engagement in the UN with innovation and technology?
I think it's youth should really ask themselves, like every time someone hears of the word UN, they're like, wow, the UN. Okay, let that sink in. How does the UN even let you be involved? Only two ways: donation or advocacy. They're like, you should donate to us, but it's unfair because youth don't have the resources to donate. They're still establishing their career. Or advocate. How much can you advocate and just talk? Like, youth want to get hands-on involved in making things happen. And that is what this my candidacy is about. I want 25% of leadership positions to be given to youth. Today, the average age of UN leadership is 62. The average age of the world is 30. Majority is under 35, the legal definition of youth. Yet youth don't have a seat at the table. So that we need to make sure that we bring leadership position to them. Secondly, like I said, we need to allow youth to gain meaningful experience in working in war zone like emergencies, so they can go help serve people, expand their experiences, and decide if this is the field that they want to continue in. The other thing is that we need to bring innovation in ways that people can work through apps and through other means to make sure that UN is able to deliver on its thing. I'll give you an example. Today in Silicon Valley, like, you have all these people who are making apps for the next best camera and things that are okay, but not like really useful in life. What if we had an entrepreneurship program where people could make apps that help humanity move things forward? We could invest in people making apps for climate. We don't really know all the areas where resources are needed. We are not really tracking where biodiversity is going down, where help is needed. So there's a lot of opportunity for climate entrepreneurs, humanitarian entrepreneurs, and just giving money to the youth and seeing what they come up with.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. As you mentioned before, experience is also a form of liability, and we see that play out in the history since the formation of League of Nations and the United Nations. So my question is, as a female millennial candidate, what are you bringing to the table that differentiates yourself from other candidates for SG?
So, so far in UN's 75-year history, we've given the role of SG to just one profile of person, older man from politics. And look where we are today. Are we proud of anything we've achieved in the world? The world, today we have the highest number of refugees and displaced people, a climate crisis that is an existential threat. And what has UN done about it? With all the movement that your generation has garnered around climate, for every dollar the UN gets, only 15 cents, 1.5, is used on nature-based solution. 85 cents goes into talking about climate change. So in 20 years from now, we won't be talking about the next SG. We'll probably be talking about where do we live? Because the way the old guard is handling this problem is just talking, holding conferences, writing reports. So what I bring is that action-oriented mentality, which millennials have. We see a problem, we want to solve it. We don't want to invest too much in talking. We are a generation that crowdsources ideas, that crowdsources implementation. We acknowledge we are not better because we're smarter. We are better because we know that we believe in something greater than ourselves, and we know together we can get to that solution. That's what is the spirit about our generation. Women have never been given a seat at the table, and feminine leadership is different. It's more determined. It's more towards solving problems than blaming. It's not about splitting the pie, it's about expanding the pie for everyone. And that is the perspective that we need right now. Youth, I think my candidacy has inspired so many young people to not delay their decision to run for office wherever they seek to. And I think we have to confront a bias and discrimination that we face as young people, that the old guard is not like, they've only given us visitation rights. Oh yeah, right. Come visit, hear our speeches, but they don't let us participate. This is a UN we will inherit. We need to be part of deciding the future of this organization and not just being given what the old guard has done. Like, they have lived a comfortable life, and now we need to make sure we can have a comfortable life ourselves and leave something good for our children behind. So it's really important that with my candidacy, I bring in the fact that we are ready to take charge as a generation.
Right. Let's move on to the topic of refugees. So do we see currently, in the current status quo, the decision-making part of the UN actually making changes for millions of refugees that are displaced?
So let's start from the beginning. How does someone become a refugee? You become a refugee when there's a conflict in your country, or when there's a natural disaster, or when there's a human rights abuse. Anytime one of these things happens, the first thing is we need to pass a decision to try to resolve these issues. That is where most of the complaints of people are, that you haven't passed a decision. And I acknowledge that solving a crisis when it started is challenging, and it requires a lot of effort. And I will talk about the conflict resolution and mediation. But when someone has become a refugee, there is no decision that ever says don't take care of them. It is under our law that once someone becomes refugee stateless, we need to take care of their humanitarian needs. And the UN is not able to meet basic humanitarian needs of these people: food, clothing, shelter, security. That leaves them having to fend for themselves. And what choices do they have? They're smuggled, they're trafficked, they're lured to joining terrorist organization. And this is a bigger abuse of human rights and is destabilizing the world. So as a priority, we need to make sure that we address the basic humanitarian needs of refugees. And the UN of today is not able to meet them because according to them, they have a funding shortfall of $4 billion. They're like, oh, we don't have enough money. But what's sad is that their travel budget is $2.5 billion annually. That includes business and first class. So it's not a lack of funding, it's lack of prioritization of funding. When people are in refugee camps, on average, a person spends 17 years in refugee camp. Half of these people are children and women. We need to make sure we do everything to depopulate these refugee camps. And the way to do that is to allow resettlement, which we all know Western countries don't like to take. So then the other thing is repatriation. Repatriation goes back to the first point. Let's allow them to go back, but for them to go back, the situation that led them to leaving has to be resolved. So then let's come back to full circle. Why did they leave? Was there a conflict? If there was a conflict, we need to invest in mediation. And the mediation today happens at political level. Like, let politicians talk to each other. Do you know what's interesting is that in our society, if a murderer does 3 murders in a row or something like that, we call them like, a serial killer. And we have like teams of psychologists, criminologists trying to find that person, like, and we've seen like all TV shows about that. In politics, leaders can get away by murdering thousands, and we don't even engage in like the right expertise to understand their psychology and to mediate it. We're like, oh, it's political mediation, as if like, it's a rite of passage for politicians to be doing that. And this is what's happening in Myanmar. So I think but just to summarize, we need to meet their basic needs, try to find them home, and then address like why did they leave home in the first place through conflict resolution, mediation with experts.
Right. So what we're seeing right now is the UN not making rational decisions when it comes to distributing fundings. So let's talk about the morality within decision making for the United Nations. So would you agree that currently the UN is not making moral decisions when they are allocating their resources?
Absolutely. They are. And I think this is where, when the camera stops, they just stop caring. Like, cameras care about the decision making, what's going on in Security Council. After that, when the money is given to the UN, there are no cameras. It's all about your moral obligation to serving people. And that's where we start to see problems because no one is observing them. No one is commenting. They just get away with poor decisions. For example, Haiti. In Haiti, there was an earthquake in 2010. UN got cholera. UN peacekeepers were sent. They got cholera, killed 10,000 Haitians, affected close to 1 million because it's in their water system. In 2016, they were told to compensate $400 million. Do you think they've compensated over the last 5 years? No. And they've spent around $10 billion on travel. This is the lack of moral and conscious leadership. That how is it that you cannot pay for people you've killed, but are spending business and first class travel? And that is what we bring, that as a generation, I think we must be outraged at what's going on. We must be outraged that this is not what our fellow humans deserve. And we need to bring that moral, conscious leadership onto the world stage.
I see. So are there, in your personal opinion, are there any way for government organizations to ensure morality within decision making and to make sure that everyone is responsible when they're considering their decisions?
I think we, the people, have to hold our leaders accountable. And like in a democratic elected situation where it's a country, you have a democracy. If a leader is not doing their job, the public can select a different leader. In the UN, those we're supposed to serve, the refugees, those in poverty situation, they are not part of the decision-making equation. They don't have social media to tell their stories. They don't have any other equipment for us to even know what's going on. So this is where it's on us as people to empathize with those whose media UN is not serving. And I think having gone through COVID, we know what difficulties managing humanitarian emergencies are, that you need to be on top of it. You need to constantly be making sure that you're making the right decisions and are engaged and involved with those you're supposed to serve. And I think that's what I bring to the table. And my leadership is all about, I'm not the solution. My generation is the solution, and everyone on board is the solution. So we need to create platforms and not pretend like we're God and we have a holy grail solution for everyone. We have platforms where everyone can collaborate and bring the world together in more peaceful and harmonious ways.
Right, I see. So one of the reasons why we are having such a large volume of refugees right now is because less economically developed countries are underdeveloped or they're either in conflicts. So are there any sort of ways that you want to go for when you're targeting the development problems with less economically developed countries?
So over the last 40 years, we've used something called a top-down Reaganomics model for development. You give money to the top and hope it'll trickle down. In 1980s, that was giving money to the Ethiopian famine. You give cash, and then we realized we killed their markets. And then it was giving it to governments, hoping it would trickle down. Then it became white NGOs, then it became local large NGOs, and we haven't seen progress. So the development model that I'm proposing is ground up, which is giving people the tools and means to develop in 21st century, which is education and internet. That's the greatest equalizer. Once we bring it to everyone, they will be able to lift themselves out of poverty, and their families and communities, countries, and environment at large, they'll be able to contribute. Today, half of the world has access to internet, and we've landed on Mars and Moon. If all of us had it, we would be living on Pluto. No problem would be too big for us. We need to ensure that everyone has access to the tools to reach their potential and to contribute to the world in meaningful ways.
Right. So we know that you had conversations with the Canadian government and you're still pending for results for the nomination. So as a person running right now and being able to experience the election process firsthand, what are some things that you learned along the journey so far?
So I decided to run for this election 2 years ago, like in 2019, after concluding the UN reforms for finance. I realized that everything was a reshuffle, it wasn't a reform, and I didn't want to accept that. I knew that UN could do better, so I knew I was going to run for this position. So in all the time I was preparing, I was gathering facts, I was gathering figures, and I was understanding what is the best way forward. How do we make a UN that functions? Never in my life did I imagine or even dream that when I announced my candidacy, I would be dealing with rudimentary and basic discrimination from leaders of the world. Like, here we are, where I'm being discriminated on the basis of factors I cannot control: my age, my gender, my experiences. I am a professional. I am not an elitist like them. I have earned my stripes of learning about what the UN is through ground up. And that experience is what's needed in the world right now to make a UN that functions, that implements. But the member states and these countries are just ignoring that and not giving its due respect. And I think this is a discrimination against our generation. That those in power just don't want to share it. They feel that they are entitled to continuing things the way they are, so it can go their way. And it's my appeal to everyone. Today, I'm being discriminated. Tomorrow, you would be discriminated, and we need to make sure our generation takes its rightful place in decision making in every part of the world, in every structure. May that be politics, private sector, or NGO, and that's what this is about. So the biggest struggle, I think, is just the discrimination, and now I think it's just the outrage of, like, how is it that we might even have a Secretary General selection process that might not be democratic, that might not be fair? What is that telling you? That in 2026 and subsequent years, you won't be able to run? And I think that's what, as a generation, we need to come together, that a free and fair process needs to be honored, which the member states and the incumbent are doing everything in their power to make sure it doesn't happen. I think discrimination is not new. Every person in the world has faced discrimination on the basis of whatever factor. As a person of color, I faced it, and as a woman, I faced it. Discrimination is not new. Those who are majority mostly treat minority poorly unless we hold them accountable. I face discrimination. I'm sure a lot of us have faced discrimination in various aspects of their life. What is important is that we fight it. In this election, the older generation is discriminating against our generation because we don't have the same number of years experience. They're not judging us based on the ideas and the merit of of our vision statement that I've submitted. So I think it's my appeal to everyone to be part of this process, to be part of a movement where we can hold a UN that is open, fair, and transparent. So I ask everyone to go on auroraforsg.org and sign the petition, a petition that would tell the world leaders that we cannot tolerate a UN election process that is undemocratic. We cannot tolerate a UN that doesn't work. We cannot tolerate a UN that doesn't value our generation. You know, UN preaches democracy to the world, but is not practicing it. UN promotes gender equality, but has failed to have a female secretary general. The UN says youth is at the center of everything they should be doing. Where is that center? Because I haven't seen it in this election process at all. And that is what we need to hold the powerful accountable, and not for me and not for any one specific person, but for a generation and for the world that we will be leaving behind.
All right. So that'll be all for today. Thank you so much, Ms. Akanksha, for joining us today. I would also really like to express my personal gratitude for your candidacy. You know, despite your presence in the UN system already, you're able to challenge the system and point out the problems. That's the vision that is so unique in modern day society. So thank you so much for joining, and have a wonderful week. Thank you.